Okay, we'll go ahead and call tonight's meeting to order of the Eugene Budget Committee.
You said we're missing it.
Monday, September 23rd, 2013. So welcome back, everybody. I missed you. So tonight, we're going to do a little bit of work to follow up on our meeting last week where we talked about some community outreach. And then we're going to actually hear a little bit from the City Council about some of the conversation that they've been having around council goals, and have a conversation about what we've heard from that and what we learned and how that will impact potentially how we want to look at using those goals as a framework for some of our budget conversations going forward. So we'll go ahead and get started. And in terms of the community meetings plan, I'm going to turn it over to Mia Cariaga from the City Manager's Office to talk about what we've put together as a next step for that.
Yes. Hi all. So in front of you, you have two pieces. And the map is a ward map with the overlay of high school boundaries, and we'll get to that in a minute. And the other is an outline for community meetings based on the feedback that we heard from you last week. And what you had discussed last week was that rather than having meetings in each ward, you'd like to use the high schools. So we've incorporated that. And that you'd like to include an educational component, and we'll get to that in a minute. We've incorporated that feedback, as well as using social media outreach and going out into the community. So those are the four pieces of information that we took from your meeting last week and rolled into the plan that's before you. So you'll see that we've scheduled meetings at all high schools with the exception of Churchill. We're still working on a date with them. And I know that Vicki sent you these dates in advance, and we're hoping tonight you can commit to meeting dates and times before the end of the evening. So there's that component. And then below that is a proposed agenda. This week we'll be filming a video presentation that will act as an educational component for 5 to 10 minutes at the beginning of each of these community meetings. That will mostly include a presentation from the city manager outlining our financial situation, what we've done to date, and sort of what our next steps are. And then, because Budget Committee will be present, we'd like each of you to introduce yourselves and talk about your role in the budget process so that that's clear to the community. And followed by small group discussions that each of you will facilitate. And we have proposed the following questions be asked in those small groups. How would you like to be involved in the budget process? What would indicate to you that the Budget Committee is doing a good job in recommending the budget? And finally, what else would you like the Budget Committee to know? And this is a means for you to hear input from the community, and it will probably come back to you in varying ways and all different topics, but this would help facilitate that. So you'd report back to the larger group and then open it up for question and answers at each of these meetings. In addition to the community meetings, you had mentioned wanting to meet the community where they're at. And so as a way to do that, we're proposing that you table at various locations. Staff would set up tables and provide you with materials to hand out, both educational and directing them to other resources, and sort of outlining the process between now and January. So if you have an interest in that, and we can give you ideas for where you might do that, you could let staff know, and then we'll help facilitate those opportunities for the community. And with that, if you have any questions, let me know.
So, Councilor Brown?
Well, I think this is great. I think the high schools is the way to do this. I've been to all the counselors have been to neighborhood meetings. That can vary. It's iffy. Usually if it's an important topic and you have it at a high school, you're going to get 200 people or more. I mean, I've been to meetings at South Eugene, and it's just like, it's packed, and that's what we want. I was just thinking, like at the small group discussions, see what else would you like the Budget Committee to know. That's nice. It's really, I feel like we kind of already know what people's broad priorities are. Fire, police, parks, libraries, things like that. But one thing I don't know that we've ever asked people is what could you live without or at a reduced level of service? That might be something, that we could ask them to think about it at these things. So I guess it's just, maybe adding something here. I would certainly ask people that in the small groups, I personally. So that'll give us a better idea of like, well, okay, in the priorities, well, maybe we could trim a little bit here and a little bit there. There's some things, no, it's either all or nothing, obviously. But other things are, and that'd be something I would be interested in hearing from people. You know, what, once they see the picture, okay, help us out here. What could you live at a reduced level, or, you know, or maybe cut out entirely certain things, so.
Great, thank you. Councilor Taylor.
Thank you. Yes, what I think we could do without is a leaf pickup, and that would make a lot of people angry. But I think we should, in addition to asking people what they think, we should give them more information. And the kind of information I want to give is what are all possible sources of increased revenue, and which ones can council do, and which ones require a vote. And I don't think we have done that. How could we, including the ones that would tax people who use our services but don't live in Eugene? And if there were an income tax, at what level would they expect to start at? Like over 100,000 or over 50,000 or whatever. But I think that a lot of people don't know about, and we do have lists of things about ways that we could raise money. And so I think that's a good thing to give out. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilor Clark.
Thank you. I want to take off on what George said there and say that I'd actually be more interested in a broader scope of information from the public, and rather say if they had more information. For example, I don't recommend we do the specific cut list, but there may be a way to put broad programs and what we spend on those programs in things that we can, information pieces that we could post on the walls in the room when they come in, so that people can get at least some sense of, you know, leaf pickup costs us X, whatever, however we could look to give them more information about that. And then ask on a broader scale, you know, the process of making decisions about cuts is all about competing priorities. So if cuts are necessary, how would you advise that we compare those priorities and or make those kind of decisions? How's the best way for us to value one priority over another? What should we be thinking about?
Thank you. I put myself into the queue next, and I had a question, and that was around whether we were planning to provide some kind of talking points or a little bit of guidance for people around how they want us, so that we're all explaining our role in the Budget Committee the same way, and so that we're facilitating in the same general fashion, because I think that would help so that we're not having 5 totally different meetings with the community. And then I like, Councilor Clark, the idea of asking people a little bit about the filters that they think we should be using, or how they would recommend that we do some of that balancing. And I like the idea of talking about revenue at some point. I'm not sure whether it's this early in the process or whether we do that a little bit further down the road, maybe after we have the revenue team kind of start to do some of their work. So I think it's worth thinking about. I think that's important. I wonder when the right time to do that would be. I might not be at this juncture. It might be a little bit further down the road. But those were my thoughts. And next is Councilor Pryor.
Thank you. I love the process. I think it's great. We could use this as an opportunity, though, to collect information, to collect knowledge. And so that then becomes critical, that you collect knowledge that's useful, that you can do something with. And I think 2 points that I think are critical. The first one is that we want to measure commitment rather than just interest. So the questions need to be asked in a way so that you're not just asking people, do you like this? Because they'll say, yeah, I like this. Or do you not like that? Because, you know, people will say, yeah, I don't like that. But there is zero commitment in there. So when you get to the time when people actually need to start ponying up, all of that, you know, support you thought you had disappears. For me, one of the greatest ways to gauge commitment is to pose trade-offs for people. Would you take this or this? In other words, if you say, would you take this? Sure. Would you take this or this, now they're forced to make a choice. And the trade-off, I think, is what's most critical for finding out where the real commitment is. That can be around revenue questions as well, whether it's revenue or cuts. Would you be willing to pay, and this is kind of what research often does, is would you be willing to pay $10 to save library services? Now, you're not going to get 100%, but you get you a whole lot closer than saying, are library services important? Of course they're important. Are pools important? Of course they're important. Would you be willing to pay $50 for XYZ? And that gives you, that forces a trade-off, which gets better commitment. The second element is asking people off the top of their head versus giving them a list. And you really need to kind of do both, because I think off the top of your head is what are the real visceral issues that are at the top of people's minds, but that only gets you part way. Then I think if you give them a list and have them start prioritizing or comparing within that list, you'll also get another kind of information, and one does not take the place of the other. They are both equally valuable.
Thank you. Jill?
Yes. So the video you're going to do, is it going to be the presentation like was done at the retreat?
Yes.
With the abundance model and the siege model and exactly how you went through that? Are you thinking of doing it? It was just so good, I thought.
Thank you. I appreciate that. But the we'll be talking more tomorrow about it. That's the intent. I think what we want to think through is what is it that people in the community most want to hear, or what do they most benefit from hearing in that presentation. That also is about a half hour, and we needs to be shorter than that probably. So we'll be thinking through that some tomorrow.
Good. And my one comment on that, so my book club, I did a little poll, and I asked about the city, the proposed $10 fee and who voted for it and who didn't, and it was very, very interesting, just in my little hypo of 10, right? But one of the things is, and I didn't have the numbers, right? Your presentation that said, you lost, like, it was 1 million, and what did it jump to? What was it, 20? Or
Went to 12 that first year, and then it built from there up to 20.
Yeah. And people, seriously, every member of my book club, voting or voted for it or not, they just looked at me like, what? You lost 20 million just like that? It disappeared? I said, like, think of it like you have a house and you make $50,000, and then one day your boss says you're making 25. But you still have all your expenses, right? And they all just like looked at me. The problem was, I was now at the very abyss of the knowledge that I had. Okay. So we were very curious to follow up, and you know what? I had none, right? And I said, I said, the city manager really knows this stuff. So I was wondering if,
I'd be happy to come to your book.
yeah, this would be a big surprise. Yeah. But I was wondering if you could give us, I'd made notes, but if you could give us a handout of the years those happened, and just really, like, we lost X amount in property taxes, so that when we're doing these group messages, presumably that's also in your video, but then people can ask about that, and then hopefully we'll have just a little bit, at least the things we need to be able to tell them factually that they can check. And one more thing, should we consider putting it on YouTube? Because then everyone will have seen it before we even get to these. It's not about look at the video in case you haven't seen it. They'll be ready to talk.
If you write a song for it.
There you go.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Budget wrap.
Yeah, budget wrap. But, YouTube's a great vehicle, and it makes us look, like we're really, talk about transparency. So, anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Pearson.
So, just a couple thoughts that I had is that I think this committee needs to think about their approach to the budget before you ask people to make decisions. I think that's what Mike was leading toward, but there are many approaches to a budget, and one of the ones that a couple of us were at was the human rights approach to budgeting, and which really talks a lot about what operating from scarcity, what that can do to the kind of budget you end up with. So I'm not making a pitch for one kind of budgeting over another, but I do think you need to think about what kind of approach to budgeting and what you hope to do with it before you actually get into asking people to make choices. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you. Councilor Polling.
Thank you. Well, I kind of agree with Betty. I think it's never too early to start talking about revenue, considering that we have the hole in our budget that we filled this last time with one-time monies. It's still there in addition to whatever we're going to be looking at ahead of time or the next year. So to put out possible different sources of revenue that are available, and like Betty said, whether it takes a citywide vote or a council vote, I think is very important to the community to know that, so we can fall back on that if we have to. And then once again, I apologize for missing some of the meetings, and I haven't had time to catch up with all of them yet on the web. But I think it's very important that at these community outreach, that we take the time once again to explain the different funds, where the money comes from into that fund, and how it can be spent, because people in the community still aren't aware that some of these funds we cannot use for anything but specific items or specific services. So that, I think, is a very important educational piece that we need to get out to the people. And also, I like the idea of listing the services and how much they cost and where that money comes from, so people have firsthand knowledge of, okay, well, it takes X amount of money to fund the police department. It comes from these different funds, or just general fund, or whatever. You know, the swimming pool, it comes from these funds. And that, I think, would give people a better idea also in their minds on how to prioritize the spending on the budget.
Any other comments? Councilor Zelenka.
A little confused about the content of the conversation with the folks from number 3 here, where it says small group discussion, how would you like to be involved in the budget process? I think people will be coming to that wanting to already be involved. So is that in addition to that meeting? How would you want to be involved?
I think so. These were actually just some starter questions. So this is a really helpful conversation, because I think what this helps us do is take this initial possible agenda and think about how do we incorporate this feedback to actually make an agenda that best uses 2 hours to both do some education and get some feedback. So when I think about people saying how they want to be involved in the budget process, I don't know that that's a big conversation versus it might be something that happens where you pass something out that says, how do you want to stay updated, or do you want to come to another community meeting in the future, or something that tells us a little bit more about how we best reach people. So I don't, that to me that's not an hour's worth of time. That's a short, focused question. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
But also, right after these sessions on the 29th, we'll be going into deliberations about where we're going to go with all this process. So I don't know that there's going to be that much more opportunity for people to be engaged. So I would think this is the opportunity for people to get educated about the budget and to make suggestions about where we should look for money or what kind of cuts we would want to make. Because if I'm going to come to one of these and I'm Joe and Jane Sixpack coming to the meeting at Sheldon High School, I'm going to come there understanding that I'm going to say what I want to say about the budget and where the city should cut it or not. Probably more along the latter, which is people coming and saying what they've said to us before, please don't cut my service, which isn't going to be particularly illuminating. It might be helpful in terms of mass numbers of people, but if we could educate them enough to be able to do what Chris and Mike were talking about, which is to do some trade-offs or be able to make suggestions, then I think it has value, or it adds value to our process, because then it will inform our decisions more.
Great.
How you get there, that's a tougher question, I think.
Councilor Surratt.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a good discussion. I especially appreciate what Councilor Polling was suggesting, and also Councilor Clark. I think maybe, and I think Alan's correct, that a lot of folks are going to show up are going to have specific ideas, specific suggestions, specific requests. So I think we might want to finesse this into a kind of hybrid approach between looking at the general context of how do you want to see your city making tough choices and prioritizing, combined with some of the more detailed specifics that people are going to come wanting to talk to us about. So that can be tricky, but I think we can accomplish that with some good thinking ahead of time. Definitely think we need to do as much educating as possible in terms of our funds. I absolutely agree that some people are going to show up ready to ask about new revenue approaches, and we should be prepared to have that conversation as part of it as well. And then my understanding is that even once we get through this process, that we'll still have our standard routine process in spring for people to come to Budget Committee and make public comment. So there'll still be additional opportunities for involvement beyond these this time frame at the end of 2013. So I think we want to keep that in mind as well, that this isn't the one opportunity to get this information from folks, but it's a more out in the community, out in neighborhoods way to do it. And so I appreciate you guys coming up with this game plan. I think it's a good one.
Thank you for the feedback. So Councilor Clark is on the in the queue, but that would take us to second round. So is there anyone else who has not been heard from who would like to make a comment? Okay, Councilor Clark.
Thank you. The time that you hear from the most members of the general public during Budget Committee times is obviously when something they favor is on the potential chopping block. As we know from having seen what happens when you put something like Sheldon Pool on the list, you get a couple swimmers at your Budget Committee meeting. Here's my recommendation. We're going to hopefully have the opportunity for people to give us a broader sense of input, a broader structural piece about competing values and about competing priorities and what they would do were they us. So let's actually make sure that we get a turnout here. I know that it's a good idea to have it in a convenient place like the school. It's a wonderful idea. But the only time we actually get serious turnout is when something's seriously threatened. Let's make, I would think, rather than just the standard sort of ads in the paper and, interested party emails, let's go to the associations and the groups and the human service folks and everybody who typically comes out when something that they like feels threatened and say, help us on a broader level. Come and participate at this, where we're not hearing just your program that's important to you, but let's try and pack the room with the same number of people who would come under such circumstances to give us broader advice. And I would think that there are pre-existing networks of communication that exist for a lot of folks and a lot of organizations across the political spectrum, as is evidenced by when something they like feels threatened. Let's take advantage of those. Let's invite those groups to rally their members to show up.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you very much. That was really helpful feedback, and we will be reforming those agendas. We luckily have a little time to pull that together, so thank you very much.
Process.
Yes, please.
On this form, do you want us to volunteer and get these in? Because there's places to write names in. Do you want us to volunteer and hand them in?
Yes, please. That would be great. We do. We really are looking to get as much of this taken care of as we can, so we know ahead of time and can make sure to communicate with the right people about the right meetings. So if you can make one of these or more than one of these meetings, please fill it out and send it up to me. Okay. So thank you very much for the feedback there. So the next thing we're going to do is actually have a conversation for the whole Budget Committee that is an update about a conversation that City Council's been having around council goals. If you recall, in August, we just had a conversation about how do we better understand how we frame the budget in terms of supporting council goals. There was conversation about, are these goals balanced? Are these goals prioritized? And how does that impact what we do as a Budget Committee? And so Council's been having some conversation about that, and I believe that the City Manager is going to update us on that conversation.
Thank you, and I'll just introduce it briefly, and then, as you mentioned earlier, if actually the councilors or the mayor can weigh in on that conversation, that would be might be helpful too. Just to give a quick background on how these even came into being, and then the council's most recent conversation, which was last week. You probably know that city councils for years and years and years here have had a variety of goals and visions and mission statements, and we wanted to continue with that. The one thing that we probably did a little bit different coming into this piece as opposed to perhaps previous councils, was to not only talk about what outcomes we're looking for, what the council's looking for, things like safe community and sustainable development, and trying to define that. What we wanted to do was, of course, connect those back up to the vision that the council has. And that vision has, I believe, been somewhat intact for many years and has just been sort of updated throughout. And so that has been a pretty constant. But having taken then the outcomes, and then we went through a very extensive Eugene counts process a couple of years ago. And what the intent of that was is to gather input from a variety of people in the community in a variety of ways, both quantitative, qualitative, subjective, and objective, to really take a pulse on, given the outcomes that the council is trying to achieve, what should we be focusing our energies on at that time? And that's what you start to see here. The Eugene Counts process, over 1,000 people had some sort of input into that, either through surveys, through interactions at meetings, at various events, and again, both talking to focus groups, for example, to getting some of that input, to actually asking people to respond in a much more scientific survey. And what we tried to ascertain is when people thought about safe community, what is it that would tell them that the community is safe? And at that time, what was on their mind was, if we decreased property crime, if we had a greater sense of safety, particularly in the downtown, more visible and accessible police presence, and that the relationship between the police and the community was better, that would give them a sense of we're doing well, we're being successful in achieving that outcome. It did not say that other aspects of public safety were unimportant. So people didn't say it's not important to have a quick fire response or an EMS response or any other part of a public safety system. What this said is based on how we could feel safe and valued and welcomed, if we saw these things, that would give us a sense of we're doing well with that outcome. And so you can look at those through all of these around what is it that was important. Increased downtown development, job creation, support for small and local businesses, ensuring that arts and culture and recreation are accessible to all incomes, using arts and outdoors as an economic engine, and some of those kinds of things. From a budgeting perspective, then, what we have done is we've taken those and said we're trying to balance all of those, and actually, if you would go back and take a look at our budgets, that's really what we have been trying to focus a lot of our community investment, our outward investment in. Downtown, you see a lot of that going on. We've been spending a lot of time with police presence and decreased property crimes and a variety of things like that. So that's where we've been trying to focus our energy. The conversation that the council had last week was, are they comfortable with these goals and outcomes and focus areas as we're moving into this next year's budget? The answer was yes, but also recognizing that as they have their annual workshop in January or February, having an interest in going back and reviewing all of these in a much more depth and much more detail. And so I think from the Budget Committee perspective, at least what I heard from the council was, let's use these as we're moving towards the FY15 budget. There'll be a much more extensive conversation in which the elected officials may choose to continue in exactly this same way or to make some focus area adjustments as we move into the longer term past FY15. So I hope I represented that well from the elected officials.
Thank you very much. So I wanted to go around, and apparently I'll be starting with Councilor Zelenka, and just give city councilors a chance to add any additional flavor to that you would like before we see if any of the citizen members have any questions we'd like to. So, Councilor Zelenka.
Thanks. So when you look at this council vision and goals statement, and if you were to look at the way it was formatted, you would think that the bottom half of the page was the more important part. But I think it's just the opposite. The vision aspect of this thing is actually, to me, the more important part of all this. The vision is the overarching things that we want to see happen in the city, and the goals and outcomes all flow out of that, and they're just more they're more specific. So I'd just like to read the vision to you all, because I think it's real important that we don't miss that. And it says, value all people, encouraging respect and appreciation for diversity, equity, justice, and social well-being. We recognize and appreciate our differences and embrace our common humanity as the source of our strength. Be responsible stewards of our physical assets and natural resources. We will sustain our clean air and water and beautiful parks and open spaces, livable and safe neighborhoods, and foster a vibrant downtown, including a stable infrastructure. Encourage a strong, sustainable, and vibrant economy, fully utilizing our education and cultural assets so that every person has an opportunity to achieve financial security. That's the overall vision of what the council wants to see happen in Eugene. All those other things below it are things that fall out of that. And so I just wanted to re-emphasize the vision part of it, because sometimes I think that's get lost because we go directly into the goals and start talking about those a lot, and I think the vision sometimes gets lost in the shuffle, and to me it's the more important thing.
Thank you. I'll just go around. Councilor Brown, do you have anything you'd like to?
Oh, yeah, no, I mean, I think I kind of agree with Councilor Zelenka on that one. And I mean, I think it's important for us to, as council, to look at this and go over it. But I really don't know if it's really going to help us practically when we are deciding, how to balance the budget. And it's nice to have this in the back of our minds, but, we still have a lot of difficult decisions to make and gather from the citizens and everything. But like I say, I think it's good to look at it, but, I hope it helps us with the difficult decisions we're going to be making in the future, but I kind of don't see the value of spending too much time on it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It's important to review it, for sure, and have it in our memory as we move on to the more complicated phase.
Thank you. Councilor Pryor.
When we were talking about this, the concept that occurred to me is there's two overlapping circles. One is the operational element of the city. That's when we do a budget. It's pay the police, pay the fire, build the roads. It's all the operational stuff that we are either required to do or want to do. This deals with the other circle, which is more kind of the aspirational element. What would we like to be and achieve as a city? When Alan talks about the vision, that what do we want to be as a city? And the goals and outcomes are where you take that vision and you start putting timelines and other measurables onto it. The operational side has to be done. You can make cuts there, but those are the cuts you need to find out what you can and cannot do. The aspirational side, and this is kind of what George is saying, are kind of the in addition to. So there's the must-dos and there's the wanna-dos. What we're looking at here is a mix of wanna-dos and maybe a little bit of what we feel are must-dos, but they're still aspirational. And so the question I had was, what are the dollars that go with this aspirational list? We know what the dollars are for the operational side of things. We know what it costs to repave a road. We know what it costs to pay police officers. What does it cost to decrease property crime? What does it cost to be transparent and interactive with our community? In some cases, it may not cost much, but in other cases, there may be a dollar impact. So after you've paid for all the operational side, do you then say whatever's left over goes to the aspirational side as if it's somehow not important? I don't think that's where we want to go either. Both operational and aspirational are important, but we have to balance and weigh, there's only this much money. How much of each one of those areas can we pay for? Can we afford? That's where the two actually do begin to impact each other.
Thank you. Councilor Taylor.
Thank you. Picking up on that, I think there's only so much money, but I think we all agree there's not enough money, and that's a part of what I think that's one of the most urgent things we have to do is think about how are we going to get more money if we want to run the kind of city we want. As for these goals, they sound good. I think they mean very different things to different people, and especially when you get to the specifics. I remember at one of our goal sessions, I've been through quite a few of them, and I remember one time we broke into small groups, and we were talking about a vital downtown, which meant very different things to the three of us who were in a group together. And how we got there was being vital meant different things to us, and also the methods to get there. So I think you can't say anything's wrong with any of this, I don't think, but I think it's a little light on the environmental side, as I said in the council meeting. To me, that is preserving the environment on which our lives depend is the most vital thing of all. Thank you.
Councillor Polling.
Well, once again, I'm going to have to agree with Councillor Taylor that, the vision and goals and outcomes, they're nice to have. It's twice in one night. They're nice to have, but they do mean something different to everybody. So my approach is, and it's similar to what Chris was saying, is as far as prioritizing our spending, what we need to do is break it down into three. It's the must-have, like to have, and want to have. Or must-have, nice to have, and want. And I think that's where the real work begins, is figuring out what that must-have is. And again, just like the vision and goals and outcomes, everybody has their own idea what that is. So I think that's where our work is going to be, is figuring out the must-have, the want to have, and like to have.
Thank you. Councillor Clark.
Thank you. I agree with much of what was said already by several, especially the part that Alan mentioned, that the vision statement is the predominant, most important part of this page. I personally don't think that particular vision statement reflects our community as accurately as I would like it to. But in reading it, there are two paragraphs of emphasis, and I'd say as a community, we're doing one of those very well, and the other one we're not doing as well and could use more effort towards. When I look at the goals and outcomes underneath that are measures of are we fulfilling that vision, I don't see the second paragraph represented as well in those as I would like, or as I think is necessary. And so I suppose I would say that this does do a decent job of talking about the city's priorities. If this comes down to an opportunity to compare priorities and say, in a competing priority situation, how must we choose? This does a good job of giving, I guess, further color and flavor and depth to what we think our priorities are. But again, I would say that it's light on relative emphasis. I would like to see stronger emphasis on the second paragraph of the vision statement and on where the community would put priorities. If they said if the community said the city government can only do one thing, what would that be? I think you'd have great unanimity that it would be a police force. Now, that's not the most important thing the city does, but that illustrates my point that comparative priorities aren't listed here, and that could be helpful to us in some way, too, is to understand relative strength of priorities.
Thank you. Councillor Sweat.
Thank you. I don't have a lot to add to the conversation. I think for the outreach that we want to do in the community, I think having these on hand for people to see and read helps at least give the community an understanding that the decisions we're making are actually grounded in something that has been discussed and vetted and mulled over and aren't just, helter-skelter in terms of how we're trying to go about the work. Whether or not, these meet all of our expectations right now, we've talked about going back in our city council retreat and adding some things I had identified, adding some language around health and safety, around recreation and open space as a potential economic engine, and also adding more about equity and maybe de-emphasizing downtown. But I really feel those aren't urgent changes that need to be made. I think the document as it sits now is limited in its use. I agree with Councilor Brown to some extent there, but still has value in its current form, and I'm comfortable having the Budget Committee use it in that context.
Thank you. Councilor Evans.
I can't say much more than what's already been articulated around the table. I think that sometimes we get very caught up in the minutia of the workings of the budget and what we're doing, and we sometimes forget about the vision. And going back to what Councilor Zelenka said, is that, you know, what I've seen over the years is this, is that as a community, we articulate a vision which presupposes certain values and certain things that we're trying to get to, but we're not always going toward the vision, and we're not always going towards the outcomes. Our outcomes are not as clear as they probably should be for the bulk of our citizens. So I just think that I want us to keep in mind that the more alignment we have with our vision, with the goals, I think that we're going to be safe in terms of the decisions that we're going to make going forward. And I want us to remind us that this is just not an FY15 conversation. We have to look at this in the broader, longer-term context, going towards what's going to happen in fiscal year 20, 22, 23, 25. Because as we go along, we have the year-to-year conversation. We're not looking, in my view, at the broader, long-term health and viability of the city if we don't start having those broader conversations about what it is that we do, that we should be doing, and what it is that maybe we should not be doing as a city.
Thank you. Mayor Pearson.
I just wanted to point out a couple things here from my perspective. The vision statement, like the first sentence when it says value all people, encouraging respect and appreciation for diversity, equity, justice, and social well-being, well, that could make you understand why we would put such an emphasis on our Human Rights Commission, or why we make choices we have that you need to consider when you think of something and you think, oh, that's probably just a nice thing, but it really may be a core thing that is at the heart of what we try to do in our city, and this sort of points you at that. We know we struggle with our parks. They're right here as some of the things that we value the most. Safe neighborhoods, a vibrant downtown, which we've made some headway on. And then you go down through the goals, and really, I think they have great meaning to people, because in fact, we have not conquered the decreased property crime issue. It's still front and center on our city plate. We do have some greater sense of safety downtown. We have a more visible police presence, and we have better police-community relations because of all the work we've done through our auditor and all of that stuff. And then you go down into the sustainable development, and I think, you know, I don't know how much you guys are aware, but if you aren't, it would be good for you to look at the Regional Prosperity Plan and see the work that the city's been doing with their partners to try to move forward as a community and build our economic well-being. And then our whole emphasis on arts and culture, and having that really be part of our, not only who we are as a community, but part of our economic future as well. So all of these things that are here have real meaning, and that they are here for a reason. And when we make decisions about what we are going to keep and what we may not keep, we should be looking at these to help guide our thinking about that, and we want you to share in that and understand that these are the things that we have talked to the community, and I don't think it's changed very much. I mean, I really do think that these capture what we may do different things to achieve those things. And what I would say to Chris is, to me, it's not what we do, but how we do it. So, you know, when we have to make decisions, do you bear these things in mind so that you do the most you can with what you have, and then if you can't do enough, then you look to how you can add to that. But just figuring out how much or how little isn't enough. It is how we do it and what we try to achieve in what we're able to do.
Thank you. So thank you all. That's helpful, I think, context for how we anticipate framing some of our budget decisions in the context of the vision and goals and outcomes and what council conversations have been. What questions, if any, do citizen members have about what you've heard here and how it may inform how we go forward in our budget work? Okay, Ken.
I'm not sure I have a question.
Or comment. Okay.
Yeah, a comment, I guess, as I listened to everyone. I guess I just want to say as we go forward over the next several months and work with the community and work with each other to figure out how to come up with a sustainable budget and how to, I guess, kind of take care of what we need to for the FY15 budget. I think this document is pretty important. I guess I would agree in the sense that it maybe doesn't need to occupy a great portion of the time at the community meetings and so on, but I think it's still important to provide to the community, to talk to the people who come to the community meetings and be sure that they, I guess, understand that we're doing our best to kind of live within this vision, live within these goals and outcomes, or do this, and maybe to kind of paraphrase the mayor, to do all of this as well as we can, given a finite and maybe not even a sufficient amount of revenue. And therein lies, I think a great deal of hard work, and we're looking for input from them about it. But I think we always need to kind of be sure this is visible, referenced, and kind of part of our thinking.
Thanks, Ken. Other thoughts? Questions? Ready?
I realize the proposal to raid the City Hall fund to fund services for this year failed, but I think the larger issue of how much money we want to take from the budget to project for future capital improvements is a question we should look at. If we're going to make making these kind of dire cuts, it's kind of hard to defend setting aside a certain amount of money so that we don't have to ask for capital bonds later. So, I mean, we all have projects we like to see funded from those capital funds, but I think it's certainly reasonable to anticipate going back to the voters more frequently in the future on capital bonds because they've told us they want to keep these services. So,
Councilor Brown. Councilor Brown.
Well, maybe that could be something we could discuss at the meetings at the schools, is find out what the broader community thinks about that idea of taking, money that could go for services and sticking it in the City Hall fund, and we could just ask people. I mean, this is part of the broad thing of all the things we're looking at to balance out. And what do you think about that idea? Would you be willing to pay on a bond measure, or would you rather have it come from services? I mean, there's probably going to be people that say, heck no, I don't want to pay for this. And I don't, but I think it would be something we could ask at the meeting.
Well, yeah, and we'll have to figure out how we can put all of this into our 2-hour meeting, so we will. Thank you. Yes, we'll see what we can do, but thank you. So, Will, did you have a question or comment?
Just looking at the goals and outcomes, I was trying to think of this in relation to the city budget, and something struck me that I don't see an obvious goal or outcome that lines up with road maintenance or other transportation things, and that was just kind of interesting to me, that there's no specific goal in that direction.
That's the operations part.
Infrastructure, yeah, it's probably the only part. Thanks. So I put myself into the queue next. So I really appreciate the conversation and also the council having some conversation around this. To me, the vision is what holds all of our decisions together and helps us not only have a framework but also be able to explain to the community why we're even making trade-offs that we're making and how we're making some of those decisions. I think it's also really important that we share with the community. I did not know prior to recently what the vision for the city was. And I didn't know what it was. And before we had our meeting in August, I didn't know what these outcomes were or how we'd arrived at them, that there was a Eugene Counts process and that there'd been a community conversation around this. I might have been living in a cave, so that's very possible, but I think there are probably other people who don't know what the vision is, don't know how we got as a community to the vision, and I think it's a really important thing to share because we are a diverse community. And I know, I spoke about the city budget to a group called the Rubicon Society on Thursday, and they had some very distinct sense of what their priorities would be, which was valuable. For every person who was there at that meeting, I guarantee if I went and talked to a different group of people, they would have a completely different set of priorities. And so I think it's really helpful for both of those groups to understand what we're doing is working towards a shared common vision that the citizens of this community have said is what we want and what we value. And as we do that, we are looking at a vision and some outcomes and taking what we hear from people over here and people over here to figure out together how we're going to support that vision. So I actually think this is really valuable, and I appreciate taking the time to talk about it because I think it's a very helpful framework. So, Councilor Pryor.
For me, what is the central question that is really in part stimulated this entire series of meetings on the part of the Budget Committee has been, what is the city's policy around the use of one-time money versus ongoing money? I mean, that is the ultimate question, and to receive help or guidance from the public, I think, is one of the critical things we need to find out, because we are wrestling with that question as a body, and we're wrestling with it as a community. And if there was one thing I heard during the entire election, it was that debate between the use of one-time money to pay for ongoing services for however long you can until the money runs out, or to use ongoing money to pay for ongoing services, or what combination of those two you want to put together. We don't even have an answer to that question right now within this body. So conversations about more revenue versus cuts are so heavily influenced by that basic conversation that's really what we got to attack right away first. I need to know where the public is with regard to their support or opposition to our continued use of one-time money to pay for ongoing services or to seek new revenue that's ongoing. What is that combination and what does that look like? I have no idea what that is. I know what my preference is, and I know what some of my colleagues' preferences are, but I cannot tell you what this community's preference is. And the difficulty is that is a question that requires a fair amount of knowledge to be able to answer intelligently. You can pose it as a simplistic question and get a simplistic answer, which ain't going to be very helpful. We've really got to get a good answer, which means we have to do a fair amount of informing in order to get a good answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's great. Councilor Surratt.
Yeah, so I don't need to pick at this, but I apologize if I misinterpreted what George and Marty were suggesting. I would not appreciate us going into these sessions with some very front-loaded questions around specific cuts. So I would not be happy if we went in and there was a list of broad questions and a specific question about, do you want to use the facility reserve fund to continue ongoing services and not fund City Hall this way? So I just want to be clear that we're going to have more high-level questions along the line, I think, of what Councilor Pryor suggested, of a policy around how do we approach this, and not necessarily asking the public to create the policy for us, but to get their input on it. So I just wanted to get that out there. Thank you.
Other comments or thoughts? Mayor Pearson.
So I think in our, and you can refresh my memory, Laura, we're not thinking we're just having one conversation and we're done with the public.
That's correct. That's not. This is the one that we have planned.
This is one we're sort of starting and engaging people and letting them know we want them to be part of this process and part of helping us do the best we can with the resources that we have, both in the short and long term, right? And so there will be a wide range of ways for the public to stay engaged and to weigh in as we move through this process, right? That
is the intent, and I think there are some things we heard here tonight that we can even figure out, are there other ways we incorporate them? So how do we build something that allows people to make some trade-off, have some trade-off kind of conversations?
What I kind of heard tonight I think I heard in a variety of ways, is do we have to get everything in this first meeting because this is the only time that we're going to be talking? Is this it? And so it says to me that we need to find a way to be really clear. This isn't it. This is the beginning of the conversation and how we're going to keep giving people a chance to be heard from as we move through the process. That will be important.
It will be important. One of the things that I heard last week from everybody, too, was that these meetings ideally are put into a context of a larger communications plan, is one of the things I heard last week about. We want to have these meetings. We want to understand how they fit into a larger plan. And so one of the things we're still working on is what does that overall communications plan look like? And partly that's because some of these conversations will inform what that next step process looks like and is what that next set of meetings might focus on. And so I think this is an opportunity, yes, not to have all of those things taken care of, but to make sure we do have some meaty, high-level conversations, though, that are not as broad necessarily as how would you like to be involved, but that are more around some of these questions about what do you think our approach should be to making trade-offs. And some of those questions where we ask the public for some feedback about how they want to see those of us who are representing them to build this budget to go about some of the work that we're doing. So I think some of those kinds of questions are probably what we want this first meeting to be about. But yes, we are probably going to need to have more, whether they look just like this or whether they happen in a different format, I think is still to be determined.
And I think in a communication plan, I think that it's fair to say we're looking for two-way communication, not just one-way communication throughout the whole process.
Correct. Yes. Councilor Taylor.
I think it's important that we not waste time talking about things that have been decided.
Such as City Hall, do you mean?
That, for one, yes. I mean, that's...
I think we should ask them.
That would just be a waste of time, in my opinion. We've decided that we're going to use what money we have for City Hall, and if we were going to do a bond, we would have decided that a long time ago. It's a little late now with that building sitting there rotting. But also about the one-time money, I think that answers itself. Unless a lot of it's going to come to us, we decided that for this year we would use one-time money while we figure out what we can do for long-time money, or continuing sustainable money. And I think we don't have a choice, really, that unless somebody's going to give us money every year, we don't have a choice of saying we're going to continue using one-time money into the future, into the far future at least. Maybe, how many years could we do that, John?
I think the last estimate was it runs out in FY15. FY15.
So we couldn't do it for very long.
Not based on the last estimate, that's correct.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jill, did I skip you?
Yes, but that's okay.
Yes, let's not skip you. Go. You're next. Sorry about that.
My question is for the city manager. So in your presentation, are you going to do a F14, 15, here's what the revenues we expect to have? Because I think that's going to be a lot of people's mind. My book club poll, everyone was saying, is it going to get better? And so again, I had no answer. I said the city manager knows. So
I wish I knew that. We won't know our forecast until as we move into November.
Okay.
Because we just don't get the property tax forecast coming from the assessor's office and eWeb's forecast, and so we won't know that until November, actually.
That's a question. That's something we can't answer for when we go out and do these.
True.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So I put myself into the queue next. So when we had our meeting together in August, Christy Hammett, I thought, did a great job of framing up a number of policy questions for us that were important to talk about in terms of how we move into this budget process. One of which was the question of these council goals, are they equally weighted and balanced, or are they prioritized in some way? one of which was the question that Councilor Pryor raised again about how comfortable are we using one-time funds and when do we do that? One of which was, I think, around what is our role in the city of Eugene in funding things where there are intergovernmental agreements and other parties are changing their kind of funding commitments, and where do we pick up? So tonight, we had anticipated talking about the question of the council goals, right? And were they weighted or were they balanced? And I just want to make sure that I'm clear as a citizen member, because I heard the city manager say that the council kind of talked and said, we believe that right now they're balanced in support of this vision. Then I went around the table and I didn't necessarily hear that feedback from councilors. And so I just want to make sure that as a committee that we're hearing, that we're clear on that. And so I would appreciate some clarification there.
I'll clarify from my perspective. What we have been doing in presenting budgets is presenting budgets in which they're balanced, and then the focus areas are the priorities within the focused areas. And so that's how we've been presenting the budgets. That may or may not represent how all the counselors believe that it should be done, but that's how we've been presenting our budgets for the last 5 years, in a balanced approach. That they're balanced.
And so you would anticipate then that you would bring forth budget recommendations based on a balanced approach?
That's what we've been doing. That's what we would continue to do unless there was some other direction.
Okay, great, thank you. So the conversation tonight was, is that still where we then are headed as a committee and how we look at the deliberations that we are planning to have? Are we still, so the city manager is saying he's going to bring forth a budget proposal based on these are equally weighted council goals and outcomes headed towards a single vision. And so what we had on the agenda was actually a conversation and an opportunity for people to weigh in about should we balance services or priorities, right? Is that, did you want to add something?
Yes, and so just to give a kind of a couple of practical things that may or may not help. So for example, if the council said that our priority is public safety, and then we will fill up those buckets first, and then what remains will get redistributed based on that. In this last budget proposal at the $5.6 million level would have been, you remember we had a fire company and then there were some police investigators there. If you were to add those two together, I don't know, that was probably $1.1 million, $1.2 million or so. If the direction was that's essentially off the table based on priority, then we would have come in with some other $1 million plus in that kind of a conversation. So that's kind of a practical.
Thank you. So that's the context in which we're looking. And so what the city manager is going to be bringing, as I understand it, forth a budget for this committee to consider based not on those things being prioritized the way that you just described, but based on this more balanced approach.
Right, and if I can add one more little piece of complexity that may or may not help. So, for example, both chiefs have done excellent work the last couple of years in reducing their overtime. And so in the hundreds of thousands of dollars as far as trying to be more efficient and prioritizing within their own organizations. And so that would be one of those. If public safety were of the highest priority, would we not then decrease overtime based on trying to find some efficiencies or not? So it adds a little bit more complexity for us in that, but the general direction we would still endeavor to meet.
So other thoughts or comments about how we hear that and anticipate looking at the budget through the lens of balance or prioritization? Okay, Mark.
So along the lines of prioritizing, it sounds as if the balanced approach, from what I understand, that the city manager has brought forth proposals of how to meet the budget gap with cuts that have the least damage, essentially. not so much along any specific priority other than trying not to lose an entire program or minimizing impacts to services. And to me, I think that's still valuable to look at it along those lines, and instead of saying, okay, we're not going to prioritize parks, so let's just cut that out and redistribute the rest of the money. I think there's still value in looking at from almost like a programmatic basis in terms of there's going to be impacts from my perspective at this point. How can we have the least amount of impacts? And every time we do that, we hear from the public that we don't want those impacts. Well, I don't think any of us want to have those impacts either. But so I think that's where, for me, the value of going out to the community is what we've heard about tonight already, is those trade-offs. And so if there's going to be some impacts, whether it's reduction of services or other programs, how can we do that best as a committee?
Other point that I mentioned when we had our process session was the budget's a very messy thing. It's not this neat, tidy collection of separate, distinct pieces that you can cut or save or keep or get rid of. Particularly on the operational side, the city's budget is, the metaphor I use is like a game of Jenga, where if you pull one out, you can get away with it sometimes. Other times, if you pull one out, the whole thing comes crashing down because things are interconnected. And so as you approach the budget, you can't approach it and say, this particular thing, I want to keep it or I want to get rid of it, because you have to take it in the context of, is if I get rid of this thing, am I pulling that piece out and it's going to cause a whole bunch of other ones to collapse? We as budget committee members are not familiar or knowledgeable enough about the operational side of this budget to know what is and what is not going to affect other pieces in the puzzle. That's really what the city manager's job is. And that doesn't mean we don't have a role, but what we need to do is to say, is this piece removable without creating any problem in the puzzle? And if it is removable, then we could remove it. But we need the knowledge of the staff to say, if we remove this piece, is it going to cause a whole bunch of other things to collapse? That's where having the staff be knowledgeable to guide us as we make those decisions, which pieces to pull out, becomes really critically important, because it's all interconnected and it's very complicated. And that's what makes budget development so difficult, is you can't just go in and pull out pieces without there being implications or consequences somewhere else. I mean, you've seen that. You know what I mean.
Thank you. Any other comments about this particular policy question or clarifications? Yeah, Chelsea.
I think it's a good approach to have the city manager provide a balanced budget, and as long as we know that's what he's up to, we can work from that. But I think there's always going to be ties in the end, and then we're going to have to prioritize individually as members, and I don't really see any way around that. So as long as we know that's what John's presenting to us, I think we can work with that, but we're still ultimately always going to have to make those tough choices. And I don't necessarily think that we can look at this piece of paper and say, it's clear. Trees above human rights, we're still going to have to think those through. So.
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. What I was going to suggest, as we went through this last budget, so there are some types of priorities that would be that this group could talk about. So, for example, when we developed that list of services, what we did was prioritize them based on a number of factors. Could they be provided by somebody else in the community? Maybe not as well. Human services fell into that category for some. It's not that they weren't needed, but others are also providing those things. We prioritize based on reducing, not eliminating. So that's a pool or library hours as opposed to eliminating an entire program. We looked at things like, how does it preserve the infrastructure? Parks is a good example. You can do so much before you actually might as well sell the park. And so at what point can you do that? We took a look at things, was it self-funding or how much did it fund itself? And so you look at some of our athletic programs, we could cut those, but there's a net zero gain because they fund themselves. And then also the impact on the outcomes for these goals, downtown support, if that's one of our goals. So in that sense, there may be some opportunities to prioritize, or some of those more important than others, which is different than prioritizing one service against the other, which is another way of doing that. So,
Thank you. That's helpful clarification. Bob?
Like you, it's nice to see the visions and goals. I don't think I'd ever seen them expressed. And I'm excited to hear what the public has to say at the meeting set up through the month of October. It starts to bring me to concerns over time frames, knowing that we have meetings now with the high schools through the end of October. I think we only have 1 or 2 meetings scheduled in November. We have to have our work done by the December 9th meeting, and I see us running out of time and spending a lot of time talking about form and function and vision and goals. And personally, I would rather start pulling Jenga pieces and finding out where the chips fall and then stuffing them back in if we have to and pull a different piece. We need to start getting through this process of crunching numbers, of trying to find revenue, and trying to help John and his staff come up with a balanced budget. And I think we're spending too much time on form and not enough on function.
Thank you. Councilor Evans?
So I'm going to take you back about 42 years with me. This is a personal issue that I think illustrates kind of where we are. When I was 10 years old, I asked my mother, I would say, why don't we have a car? Why don't we have a colored TV? And I want a new bike. And she just took me back a few more years and said, you remember when your father died? I made a decision to keep a roof over our head, sell the car, get a bus pass, which was our option, and that didn't the black and white TV work fine? I said, well, yeah, it does. I said, but it's not colored like my friend across the street had. I said, well, we have one income. We can't afford it. They have 2 incomes. The priority was keep a roof over your head, get you to college, and we had other alternatives to be able to deal with transportation issues and other things. And the point I'm trying to make is the point that Chelsea just made. Everything is a priority. Everything is a priority. And so you are defined, and my mother told me this very clearly many times. She said, we're defined by what we spend our money on. What is most important to us is what we spend our money on. And so I think that that's the thing that in this conversation should drive us in terms of where we're going. What is most important to the city should define where our money should be spent. And maybe we can't afford that color TV, and we can't afford a car, and maybe we can't afford a number of other things that we'd like to have that, the rich folks across the street, say in Portland, may have. But we have to deal with the finite pie that we have. And she said, Greg, if you want a new bike, there's a paper route 3 streets over that you go do. And so that's what I did. I went and got a paper route. So I increased my revenue by adding another source. So, that's the fundamental thing that I think that we are grappling with in this conversation, is being able to understand that what we most care about is what we're going to spend our money on.
Thank you. So I put myself into the queue, and then I have Marty next. So first of all, thank you for sharing those filters. I think that's really helpful to hear about how you and the staff thought through reducing, not eliminating, preserving infrastructure. I think those are also the kinds of things that I'm hoping we will share transparently as we go forward so that the community understands those too, because I'm not sure that those are always well understood by people, and I think they're really helpful to hear. At least, even if people don't agree, at least they can understand that this wasn't a willy-nilly decision-making process. Thank you, Bob, for sharing your perspective. So this is the role of this group, is to keep me and us honest about how we balance some of these kind of framework conversations with diving into the nitty-gritty, and we will have to balance that as we move forward. So that's a good conversation for us to continue to have. And finally, Councilor Evans, I absolutely agree with you. I think that part of the reason I got on the Budget Committee is because, to me, that's what budgeting is. Budgeting is your priorities and your values made visible to the community, right? What we choose to spend our money on is what we value and what we prioritize. And so that's where I think we need to hear from the community, and we also need to remember that the community, it sounds like, did weigh in to some degree on creating this vision originally and creating these goals and outcomes. And so that is somewhat also of hopefully some feedback that's been gathered through the years about what the community cares about. But those are the filters I think we'll all be using as we look at what do we value the most, and therefore what are we going to spend our money on. So thank you for that. Marty, you're next.
I guess I just wanted to clarify my early one. I do not necessarily advocate going out to these public meetings and saying, what do you think about City Hall? What I'm trying to point out is that we managed to save about $40 million over the 11 years between 2001 and 2012 for a City Hall replacement. In doing that, we were choosing to save some money that could have otherwise been used for services, which was fine. It was the right decision to make. A new police station was probably not going to pass a capital bond in this town. And sometimes you do have to build a police station or a sewage treatment plant or something that is not popular but is necessary. But I think going forward from this point, it is reasonable to ask the public through this process, do you want us to keep saving for future improvements that the next generation will enjoy so we can buy those in advance? Or do you want us to ask, at the time we're considering building those improvements, the people who are going to be using them to pay the taxes to build them? And that's what we're doing with a bond. So I'm sorry, people fixate on the City Hall thing. I understand there are just different sides of those issues, but I think we should take a step back and say, how much do we want to save for infrastructure at the cost of present services, versus ask for the money later or reprioritize later when we do it. So.
Thank you for that clarification. Councilor Clark.
Thank you. I want to take off from what Marty said, because I think he's exactly right. One of the issues we grappled with 3, 4, or 5 years ago now, and I think we made some good headway on, was we had a $170 million backlog of road maintenance and under maintained roads as a capital issue, and that's a direct choice of regular maintenance spending coming at a cost that we had to deal with in a different way later. There are several infrastructure issues there, and whoever said it, I apologize, but I can't remember. I don't see that adequately reflected on our goals either, how we deal with infrastructure. There's also one other point that, while certainly I don't want to have set up questions that are, politically charged or loaded that could become issues in the public information gathering phase, I would like to see at least the Budget Committee dealing with a part of some issues that touch the budget a little differently. We look back very well. We say, look at last year's budget, here's what we spent, how do we deal with ongoing revenues for ongoing services that we know about. But at Council, we're constantly presented with new challenges and new problems that we'd like to solve and how they fit into the budget structure, one of which, for example, the other night, was a discussion about finding money for Civic Stadium. And we're not talking about at the Budget Committee level the contingencies for other council-related things that come up. Are we going to create some manner of new spending to deal with the issue of homeless? Do we have the capacity to do that, or don't we? If so, what's our contingency for doing that? These are issues of future challenges or things that are before council now that I'd like to see us weigh in at the Budget Committee level for as well.
Thank you. Sorry, Councilor Zelenka. Yep.
2 comments, one about capital. So we actually asking the public for capital is extremely rare. It's very rare in the case of how much capital we actually spend. Almost all of it is actually done within our budget. John, do you know off the top of your head what the annual capital budget is for the entire city on an annual basis? It's tens of millions of dollars sometimes.
I don't, most of that's in a lot of the utilities as well as some of the road projects can be
Right.
considered capital, but yes.
Scattered throughout the whole budget too, and
Most of it's not general fund.
right, and most of it's not general fund, and we actually woefully underfund our capital projects that we need to do in order just to maintain the infrastructure that we already have. So I don't know if we're well served by every time we want to spend some capital, we ask the public. I don't know which projects would we talk to them about. There's so many of them that we spend and do on an annual basis that and we don't go out on a regular basis and ask people for bonds to do capital projects. So I'm not sure where that conversation goes because it's so embedded in the way that the budget is built and the way that we approve the budget on an annual basis. And speaking of the budget, when you think about the budget process, the job of the budget committee is actually to adjust the budget, not to build the budget. You kind of inherit the budget. You inherit years of decisions and years of reactions and years of programs, and then on an annual basis we have to adjust the budget to react to what's happened in the last year, whether or not our tax revenues have gone down dramatically, or we got more tax revenues, or this thing happened or that thing happened, and we have to relate and we have to change the budget in order to deal with it. And as Councilor Pryor was talking about, it's very interrelated, and there's so many unintended consequences that can occur if you pull one of the Jenga pieces out and something else happens over here that costs you twice as much money, and it's also zero sum, so you have to keep it balanced, and it's very complex. $380 million budget isn't something you kind of just go, oh well, let's just do this, let's do that. It actually takes a lot more studying to do, and all of you that have been on the budget committee for the amount of time know that it takes a while to even just understand the budget, much less participate in it. So, and then we all have to take into consideration all what the public is saying, and then we leave it up to the city manager to develop a budget based on the council's vision, the public input, the circumstance, to the best and the expertise that he has, and that's what the budget process is about.
Thank you. Councilor Taylor.
I just want to mention something fairly simple, which is related to what the city manager said, and is could be expanded to big other things. When we had a fund shortage some years ago, they decided not to water the parks at all. And trees died and shrubs died, which ended up costing a lot of money. More recently, our current manager and our current council did not decide not to water things. We have neglected some of the mowing, and that kind of thing can be repaired later if you don't mow the grass. But if you don't water the perennials and the trees, you lose them and you end up spending more money. And I think that can be transferred to other things too, where you think of the long-term consequences always. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Evans.
I think education is important in this conversation, because I think Councilor Clark mentioned, or maybe someone else mentioned, about the homeless situation. And, while we are kind of the lightning rod for people to vent their concerns and issues about this, it is not part of our budget mission, nor our responsibility jurisdictionally to deal with human services issues. We put money to human services by contributions to the county fund, and the county is ultimately responsible for dealing with human services. The city's responsibility is for dealing with public safety, public works, planning and development, and recreation. And we need to be cognizant and remind ourselves, yes, we want to stretch ourselves to help who we need to help in our community, but there are other people who are jurisdictionally responsible for taking care of those issues and needs in our community. And we need to understand, to help people in our community understand where that focus needs to be, that we don't have the budget to do the things that you think we should be able to do. But there are other jurisdictions and entities who still, they may not have the budget either, but they do have the responsibility for dealing with these issues.
Thank you. So we have about 5 minutes left. Any final thoughts or comments before we come to a close for the evening? Okay. So thank you very much for the conversation tonight. We thank you also for being willing to sign up to be part of these community outreach meetings. We will be doing a little bit more work in the coming weeks to refine that agenda, as well as I'll be working with city staff to make sure that there's at least some framework, talking points, some things so that people can know be a little bit armed to go out into the world. Yes, Mia, do you want to add something?
Yes, I'm sorry,
Great,
just really
please.
quickly. We do have a date for the Churchill meeting.
Oh, great,
That
okay.
will take place on October 30th.
Also at 6:00.
So Mia,
Halloween costumes are required.
that's right. That'd be great. Thank you. So if you can either pass any dates that work for you either to me or to Mia.
That's a good one.
And Mia, what's the best way if someone didn't have the ability to respond tonight, but they look at their calendar and find that they can attend a meeting? What's the best way to communicate that information?
They can email me. I can send a summary of this through Vicki.
Okay,
who I'll
that would be
review,
great.
and then
Yeah.
give contact information.
And that way we can also see what's not filled and people can fill in whatever else is left. So thank you in advance for being willing to go out into the community. I think we will learn a lot and hopefully we will also educate a lot. So with that, thank you for your time tonight and we are adjourned.
All right, thanks, Mia.
Yeah, if you have time, I think that'd be great.
I was going to finish it.